Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American people are deeply concerned about the politicization of domestic terrorism. This issue has been at the forefront over the past month in response to an order from the Attorney General for the FBI to convene meetings across the U.S. in response to constitutionally protected speech and assembly at school board events, particularly in Virginia. In September, the National School Boards Association released a public letter to President Biden requesting federal assistance to address alleged violence targeting children, school board members, and educators. The letter referenced increased threats of violence due to frustration over mask mandates and the teaching of critical race theory, and requested, quote, the federal government investigate, intercept, and prevent the current threats and acts of violence against our public school officials through existing statutes, executive authority, interagency and intergovernmental task forces, and other extraordinary measures. The letter went on to state that, quote, the classification of these heinous actions could be the equivalent to a form of domestic terrorism, and it requested that the administration review all applicable laws and policies, including the Patriot Act, to relevant enforcement options due to the threat. We know, according to emails obtained by the group Parents Defending Education, that the school board coordinated this letter with the White House prior to this release. 5 days after the release of the School Board Association letter, the Attorney General released a memo directing the FBI to meet with leaders to discuss strategies for addressing threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff. In testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, Attorney General Garland confirmed that this letter was the relevant factor in the creation of the memo that was sent out by the Department of Justice. This is the politicization at the Department of Justice without facts to support the alleged growing threat and need for federal investigation, specifically targeting parents and parental groups. We now know that that the School Board Association released a statement to its member rescinding the letter, saying they, quote, regret and apologize, and yet the Attorney General has not retracted this memo. I have a few yes or no questions. Has the FBI held any of these meetings directed by Attorney General Garland? Yes or no?
I don't know that. They were led by the U.S. Attorney's offices, so I would think that it's best directed
in conjunction with the FBI.
I do not have that number. But they
have held meetings. What's the number?
I do not know, ma'am. We can look into it, though. I believe the date was by today. It was led by the U.S. Attorney's Office.
In conjunction with the FBI?
Yes, ma'am. And we'll get you that number. But I do not have that information because it was the date was supposed to be today, and it's being coordinated by the 94 different jurisdictions. But the invited was the FBI to attend.
Correct. Does the FBI consider parents domestic terrorists?
No.
Do parents who oppose CRT, are they considered domestic terrorists?
No, to my knowledge.
No to your knowledge?
No, as long as the individuals are not committing federal violations, force or violence, or in promotion of an ideology, they would not be.
Are parents who oppose mask mandates considered domestic terrorists?
No.
Let me ask you this. What are your thoughts? Because the Attorney General Garland memo was based upon the School Boards Association letter, which has now been rescinded, why has the department not rescinded the Garland memo?
You would have to refer that question to the Department of Justice.
Do you think that it should be rescinded?
I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Attorney General, ma'am.
Do you have any other thoughts to add?
I would only add that in addition to the letter that was submitted, there were actual calls for violence directed at teachers, school board administrators, and others in the educational environment on extremist platforms. We did reach out to state and local law enforcement. There have been some sporadic incidents of violence at school board meetings and in educational facilities. However, the information we received is that state and local law enforcement were not seeing widespread action. So we're continuing to work with state and locals to maintain awareness of the environment if there are threats of violence directed at anybody, because the threats were not just not focused on school administrators in the information that we were analyzing, but it also included threats against law enforcement and public health officials who were giving vaccines and involved in other public health-related activities associated with COVID. So it's just something we continue to evaluate.
But you are aware that the Attorney General said under oath when he testified that the relevant factor in the Garland memo was the School Boards Association letter. You are aware of that?
I did not watch the Attorney General's.
Well, that's what he said, and you're answering very differently here today. He said that that was the reason for the memo that was put out by the Department of Justice, and obviously voters spoke loudly and clearly in Virginia last night. With that, I yield back.
The lady yields back. Is membership in a white supremacist organization disqualifying for people applying to the FBI or work at the FBI, Mr. Langan?
Yes.
Isn't membership in that type of organization inconsistent with the effect law enforcement?
Yes.
How is the FBI coordinating with local and state law enforcement about incoming threats and information about white supremacists and other DVEs? I know, having worked at the Fusion Center, there was an analyst assigned there, as well as, you guys built a skiff there. But there was always some tension with local law enforcement, as you know, and the FBI, because there was a sentiment that, local law enforcement does the work and the FBI comes in at the last minute when the press shows up. I think in many cases that's unfair, but have those coordinating efforts improved over time? The past
Sir, I've been in law enforcement now for 28 years and served for the government for 31 years. I actually have not found that often. There's definitely rivalries, or there's definitely frictions that occur on an individual basis, but I found the coordination between local state officials and the FBI to be very wholesome. Of course, there's at times prosecutorial differences on if the case should be worked at a state level or federal level. But again, I'll refer back to the foundation of what our sharing is, and those 200 Joint Terrorism Task Force with almost 4,500 agents and officers working hand in hand together. So when information reaches their departments that potentially contains a federal violation, ideology, the concern of a JTTF, then that information is forwarded from that task force officer into the JTTF. They can review that information to determine if there's enough predication to move forward with a potential investigation.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cohen, it's no secret that the IC failed to adequately warn of the insurrection that occurred on January 6th. Sir, can you explain what specific procedures have changed and what reforms have been instituted post-January 6th?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there are a lot of lessons that we in law enforcement and in the intelligence analytic world learned from January 6th, both the events of that day and the weeks leading up. To the point I made in my opening statement, the understanding that indications regarding an emerging threat may be available through public information that is analyzed by analysis. What we have done since January 6th at the department is we have redoubled our efforts to coordinate the sharing of threat-related information that we acquire or that comes to us through our relationships with state and local private sector with the FBI and others in the federal community. We have become much more forward-leaning as it relates to the analyzing of online activity and evaluating activity from the perspective of the potential risk of violence. We have, I would say that we are probably much more cognizant and mindful about incorporating that threat-related information into operational planning. And I think a very good sort of example of the differences that exist today versus on January 6th would be one just to simply look at what happened on Inauguration Day. After January 6th, the analysis of online activity did not reflect that those who were here on January 6th viewed it as a victory and as the end point of their efforts. They actually saw it as a starting point. And there were calls online for additional acts of violence to be committed both in the District of Columbia and in state capitals around the country on Inauguration Day or in and around Inauguration Day. The response by law enforcement was very different. The response here in Washington included physical security measures in and around the Capitol and other locations, a highly visible presence of National Guard, highly visible presence of law enforcement, a very overt and public security presence in and around District of Columbia and state capitals around the country. Well, what did we see reflected on social media and extremist platforms? A cognizance of those security measures and a reluctance to come to Washington because those who were planning acts of violence viewed it as a trap being set for their arrest or viewed it as not the right time to come and engage because of the security presence. There's a lesson in that. So our analysis has focused much more on understanding when there may be a potential act of violence and then taking steps, sometimes very visible steps and public steps, to create physical security measures that serve as a deterrent.